I am Dr. Vasudha. I'm a consultant pediatric oncologist at Rainbow Children's Hospital, Bangalore. And I will be moderating this session. This will be a case-based session, particularly useful for all the trainees who have joined us today. Um, like we know, children with cancer are at increased risk of life-threatening emergencies. And these emergencies can happen either during presentation with the underlying malignancy itself or secondary to chemotherapeutic agents. And multidisciplinary approach, the purpose of it that it will allow early intervention, minimize morbidity and mortality. For this panel discussion with me, we have got four great panelists. Please allow me to introduce Dr. Rakshay Shetty. He is our head of pediatric intensive care services at Rainbow Children's Hospital, Marathali, Bangalore. Dr. Chintan Vyas. Dr. Chintan has done his pediatric hemong fellowship followed by an extensive BMT experience at Singapore, Great Ormond Street and St. Mary's, London. He is a consultant pediatric hemato-oncologist at Jaslok Hospital and Research Center, Bombay. Dr. Manu Chaudhary, who is an American board certified infectious disease expert. She's a consultant pediatric infectious diseases at Rainbow Children's Hospital. And Dr. Kaushik, our pediatric surgeon, who is a consultant at Rainbow Children's Hospital, Bangalore. Welcome all panelists. So we'll go on to the first case. This is a 5-year-old boy who came with fever since 4 days, some abdominal discomfort and vomiting since 1 day, with palpable bilateral cervical inguinal lymph nodes and hepatosplenomegaly on palpation. His CBC showed a hemoglobin of 8.3, a WBC count of 3,65,600, platelets of 71,000, sodium of 140, potassium of 4, uric acid of 6.5, and phosphorus of 2.7. My first question is to Dr. Rakshay Shetty. So you must be seeing these kind of presentations in your practice in the pediatric ERs and ICUs. What would be your initial evaluation and management in this child?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Vasudha. So my perspective is purely from intensive care area, and I'm sure that a lot of audience here are quite experienced oncologists. So yeah, oftentimes it's not uncommon to have the first presentation of malignancy in ICU, and many times they're undiagnosed. And we do come across patients where we need to think about malignancy as one of the options, and the most common generally we see related to HLH, but we do see a lot of mediastinal masses lining up in ICU and at times leukemia too. So like you said in this patient, I think it's pretty straightforward with the multiple lymph nodes across the body with organomegaly, and then your CBC, which kind of clearly tells you that you're probably dealing with some amount of leukemia. And like you showed in the next slide, what we generally do with a lot of these patients is send all those investigations, what you mentioned, CBC, peripheral smear, reticulocyte count, we send a flow cytometry, we of course involve the oncologist immediately, and send the renal function and electrolytes, LDH, coagulation, and chest X-ray. And the chest X-ray, especially the mediastinal mass, is extremely important for us from intensive care perspective, because a lot of these patients, when they want to get a sedation, it might be for bone marrow, it could be for LP, for intrathecal, or it could be for the CT scan. The mediastinal mass is something which really worries us, and we need to be extremely careful about how do we sedate those patients, because it can be catastrophic, and there's a possibility of mortality in someone with a significant mediastinal mass which is compressing the airway, because the potential of losing tone while sedating, especially while muscle relaxing, these patients, you can have a catastrophic event. So we have tend to be very careful from intensive care perspective. From other thing about intensive care perspective, obviously we get worried is the counts, and especially with that count what you mentioned of around 3.8 lakh and a hemoglobin of 8.3. So this patient clearly fills into this criteria of what we call as hyperleukocytosis, but the question is, do they actually develop leukostasis or not? And oftentimes patients who land up in ICU with the diagnosed cancer or land up getting admitted is generally because of leukostasis. And generally I think what count causes leukostasis, that probably depends upon the etiology of that leukemia. And so leukostasis generally we mean that if the counts are high enough to cause end organ dysfunction, and typically we talk about CNS manifestations and pulmonary manifestations. So generally it is seen with more of AML, and typically in more of myelomonocytic or monocytic AML. At times I think even M5 promyelocytic leukemia also it can happen. Very rarely in the CML with the blast crisis. But generally, when we talk about ALL, we generally think about tumor lysis syndrome as well as DIC, and that becomes for us a very important part of management in ICU about how do we actually protect the kidneys during tumor lysis syndrome, how they don't land up with severe hypocalcemia and its consequences, and how do we hydrate those patients adequately and prevent the consequence of tumor lysis, and then the therapy related to that. So to answer the question about leukostasis, like I said, predominantly generally seen in AML, and the difficult part obviously is the treatment aspect of it, and also the concern is sometimes despite actually reducing the tumor burden with an appropriate treatment, up to a week after even the cells come, there is a significant amount of risk of developing a significant IC bleed. Now, why that happens, it's not very clear. Why leukostasis per se happens is also not very clear, but there is an element of ischemia and reperfusion injury. So once endothelial injury is done and once your tumor burden comes down, and the reperfusion to the area can make capillaries very leaky, and it can cause subsequent complications like massive bleeding and into the brain. And unfortunately, once you develop a significant leukostasis, the mortality in them tends to be very high. It can reach up to 80 to 90%. So that is something we get really anxious about. So patients like this, like I said, if you're thinking about tumor lysis, we make sure that we hydrate them quite well, 3 liters per square meter per day. Now, question is what kind of fluids you use. Traditionally in ICU, we always try to go for isotonic fluids, but here is a case where you might have to tailor make fluid depending upon the electrolyte imbalances we see, what kind of potassium you see, what kind of calcium you see, phosphate we see. Should we be giving high sodium? Should we be giving low sodium? A lot of it will depend upon the clinical situation. So we would definitely be starting them on antibiotics and cultures, strict antibiotic monitoring, and then obviously between allopurinol and raspberry case, you would discuss with your oncology team, and depending upon its availability, you would start one of those. And one of the very important things, especially in the perspective of leukostasis for us, is to prevent making it worse. For example, this is 8.3, not too bad, but let's imagine someone comes with hemoglobin of 6, giving a blood on top of it, or starting diuretics without adequate hydration. These things can certainly make leukostasis worse. So that is something we keep a close attention at. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much, sir. Like you said, yes, a peripheral smear examination was done, and a word of caution for all. Please go and have a look at the peripheral smear, because as Murphy's law would have it, these patients usually tend to come on a Saturday evening or something like that, where you find it very difficult to get a flow cytometry. And this patient had about 82% blast in the peripheral smear with very high nucleoid cytoplasmic ratio, and the flow cytometry of acute myeloid leukemia. The following day, unfortunately, this child became quite drowsy and developed one episode of generalized seizures. Immediately, a CT brain was done, and the complication that we were fearing, he had hemorrhaged into the left frontal lobe, and there were multiple subcortical hemorrhages as well. His sensorium dropped very rapidly. My next question to Dr. Chintan Vyas is, in this situation, so you've just got the flow cytometry report. What would you prefer in this child? Either a leukophoresis, would you go for a leukophoresis, or you would right away initiate chemotherapy to reduce the counts?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Vasudha, for having me. So a very interesting case scenario, and we used to see these kind of cases a lot. And when we have the diagnosis of AML, as a clinician, our blood pressure also increased, because as Dr. Shetty has suggested, that AML with a very high cell count is a very dreadful situation in case of hyperleukocytosis. Now, when we talk about the leukophoresis versus initiation of chemotherapy, so till date, there are not very convincing studies to suggest one better versus another. So like there are only 4 or 5 studies, and out of which 3 only randomized double-blind controlled studies, which compared one versus another. And the biggest study was from SickKid. So when they compared that in which disease setup the leukophoresis can help, they found there is no particular one disease setup where leukophoresis can help, even in ALL with high white cell count or in AML with high white cell count. They said the outcome ultimately remains same whether you use leukophoresis or you use debulking chemotherapy. Only one condition where I found it can be useful is in CML with blast crisis, and if the patient presents as a priapism. In that case, probably the leukophoresis as an urgent measure can help. But in rest of the cases, sometimes it's difficult to get it done, and even if we do, it doesn't make much change in terms of the overall outcome. So I would, if you ask me, I would personally go for the debulking chemotherapy as a first choice. And just for further one point for the trainees here, that one condition, particularly when you are having bleeding diathesis and when you are having AML, you must rule out APML. And you must rule out in peripheral blood smear, in your bone marrow morphology. It is a very classical blast percentage, and you don't have to wait for the PML R alpha results, and you can start on it. But if it is APML, a word of caution: please do not do leukophoresis. There are studies which says that if there is an APML, it can bring a catastrophic event if you do leukophoresis in that particular context. So the chemotherapy of choice for AML would be a low dose cytarabine, 100 milligram per square, continuous infusion. Yeah, you can decide whether you want to give anthracycline or not, depends on the infectious status of the patient, because these patients are very sick. They present with sometimes severe bacterial infections, severe fungal infections, and we know already there's a bleeding. So whether to use donorubicin on after some days, like a couple of days or 3 days, is depends on the patient's clinical situation. And we can always use hydroxyurea also in these type of cases. And some centers does also use low dose etoposide for this particular conditions, particularly in AML. And other supportive care measures, Dr. Shetty has already highlighted the importance of hydration, tumor lysis, electrolyte management, avoid blood transfusion, and platelet and blood products management. But another important thing, that apart from managing the bleedings and all the counts and tumor lysis, the antifungal prophylaxis and antibacterial prophylaxis is very important, because these patients are not neutropenic when they present with. These patients are neutropenic for long. So antifungal prophylaxis and other antimicrobial prophylaxis are very important.
Thank you, Dr. Chintan. Dr. Shetty, is there any specific neuroprotective measure or any neuro monitoring for this child?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the CT scan, what you just showed, it's a pretty bad disease, right? And unfortunately, like I just mentioned, these patients do carry very high mortality. And someone with this kind of an IC bleeding obviously lands up getting intubated, and various neuroprotective measures in terms of maintaining a very good blood pressure, because the perfusion to the brain is extremely important. Maintaining the CO2 levels within 30 to 40, not allowing hypercarbia as well as hypocarbia, temperature management, making sure the fever does not control the fever very aggressively, controlling your sodium. So you don't want hyponatremia to happen. So again, when we sometimes in tumor lysis syndrome, the kind of fluid we give becomes half normal saline to less than that. So that can be a bit tricky, because you don't want sodium to go less than 145 at least in this particular patients. And and then keeping a child very well sedated, starting on anti-epileptic medication, starting on if you have a facility of doing transcranial Doppler, seeing how the blood flow goes, how the autoregulation of the brain is preserved, and starting on anti-epileptic prophylaxis. This is what we would generally do in this kind of situation.
This is what the child was started on levetiracetam for anti-epileptic prophylaxis, and he'd also had a seizure. Anti measures, he was started on cytarabine, and then donomycin was added, like Dr. Chintan suggested. Counts gradually reduced and reached nadir by day 10. Day 10 CBC showed a HB of 5, WBC count of 1000, ANC of 300, and platelets of about 30,000. Over the period of 10 days, his sensorium gradually improved, and he shifted back to the ward. Developed fever on day plus 12 of induction onwards, started on first line piptaz and amikacin after collecting cultures. There was no clinical focus of infection, and blood cultures were negative. His procalcitonin was 50 and CRP was 100. And as expected, there was complete pancytopenia. The hemoglobin is supported, and the ANC was only 100. So this question is to Dr. Manu Chowdhury. In immunocompromised patients like this, what is the role of inflammatory markers? Is CRP better? Is a procal better? Is there any specific time of collection?
So thanks for inviting me, Vasudha. Role of inflammatory markers in immunocompromised host should be in the setting of whole patient. Okay, it's one marker is not better than other, and then it just based on the markers, you cannot decide your therapy. So it has to be how the patient is clinically, where in therapy he is, and are we finding focus. CRP, yes, basically we've always used CRP. We've been more comfortable with CRP. PCT is something new. PCT rises early and falls early. CRP rises late and falls late. I have used PCT only for more of negative predictive value. So if it's negative, it kind of calms me down. But again, all these immunocompromised hosts, just based on one marker, do not decide your decision making.
Okay, it's the clinical scenario that's more important than the thing. So this was, of course, he continued to have high-grade fever spikes even after 48 hours of first-line antibiotic therapy. Blood cultures were repeated. Antibiotics were stepped up to meropenem. Amikacin was continued. But again, in the next few days, he developed tachycardia and hypotension and required a second PICU admission because of the hemodynamic instability. In this scenario, do we empirically change antibiotics, Dr. Manu? And what do you think about adding an antifungal right now?
Sure. So multiple factors come into picture, right? First is your host. He's AML, so very high risk host in induction. So adds to the high risk. Second is he's been in the hospital for almost 12 days now. So you're worried about hospital acquired infection also. In India, we are seeing a lot of drug resistant gram negatives, which are making these kids sick. And, with catheter in situ, you again worry about catheter related, these drug resistant gram negatives. So definitely, and these kids give very less time. So you have to go broad and cover those gram negatives, then wait and upgrade. So you always upgrade first and de-escalate based on the clinical response or whatever you get in your cultures. So definitely we'll change the antibiotics. Usually we end up going into using polymyxins now. So colistin or polymyxin B, unless your source is UTI, then you end up using colistin. Otherwise, poly B is also a very good drug. Cannot be used as a single drug. That's why the susceptibilities are also always mentioned intermediate, even if it's susceptible. And then your second additional dose, because only a single therapy will not help. So you end up using for these drug-resistant organisms, combination therapy. So either TJ cyclidine or fosfomycin. So those basically broad spectrum antibiotics we start. Role of additional antifungal, yes, it's very clearly through the guidelines of American Society of Clinical Oncology and European Medical Oncology, 96 hours high risk host. We have to start thinking in regards to antifungal coverage and start looking for it, getting a CT scan of the chest. Is there a new focus? Ultrasound, are there hidden abscesses that are developing? So yes, eventually based on your host, you add liposomal ampoule.
Thank you, Dr. Manu. So, Dr. Shetty, is there any updates in the management of sepsis and septic shock, in particular attention to immunocompromised patients?
Yeah, there are general principles about sepsis and septic shock, right? So what general principle matters is the dose of first dose antibiotics. So if you become hypotensive and if you don't get an appropriate antibiotic and an appropriate dose, the mortality seems to increase by 10% every hour. And that becomes far more important. And just like what Manu mentioned, and child who's already in the ward, already on meropenem and amikacin and becomes sick. So then it's extremely important that you upgrade your anti-microbial therapy accordingly. And that's very, very important. And that's more often not, it's not like you wait for culture for 48 hours later. It's not like a febrile neutropenia where patient is hemodynamically stable. You've started some antibiotics, you're waiting for a culture and then upgrade 48 hours later. That cannot happen here once a shock sets in, because the patient would not survive even next 48 hours. So that's first very important point, that you make sure your antibiotic coverage, what you're giving, covers appropriately. The second aspect, what we're learning of late, is being a bit more restricted with the fluid therapy. Earlier, the fluid resuscitation used to be very aggressive, and now we kind of limit. As in adults, it's now 30 ml per kg, you don't go more than that. In pediatrics too, I think we're limiting more into 30 to 40 ml per kg and start vasopressor support much earlier. So generally, if you reach around 40 ml per kg of fluid bolus, you would consider starting norepinephrine in most of these patients. So I think these two are extremely important aspects of management. Guiding your fluid therapy, not being very aggressive with fluid therapy, giving a correct dose of antibiotic. And nowadays we use a lot of point of care ultrasound to make a lot of these decisions. And depending upon the phase of chemotherapy you are in, phase of illness you are in, some of these patients could have cardiac dysfunction. So being mindful of cardiogenic aspect also of the shock, in addition to the septic shock. So a lot of these decisions have to be taken at the bedside, looking into the picture holistically.
And I just want to add on one thing. Always know your local antibiogram. So just know what kind of infections are prevalent in your setting and what kind of antibiotic resistance pattern are prevalent. It helps with your empiric treatment in these cases.
So true. So, Dr. Chintan, this is the ultimate nightmare for an oncologist. AML child in day 13, 14 of induction developing probably, multi-drug resistant bacteremia. So what is the role of granulocytes in this situation? Granulocytes, GCSF, is there any utility of using these?
Yeah, so granulocyte looks very promising, but it is not straightforward. Like we have used granulocyte infusion in around 5 to 6 patients. Out of these three patients were in transplant, 2 AML and 1 aplastic. Now, you need to know that the granulocyte infusion should not be used too late when the patient is on ventilator, when the patient is on inotrope. Probably we are too late to use the granulocyte infusion. It should not be used too early also, like just on day 3 or day 4 of febrile neutropenia, and it's the AML induction or relapse AML or relapse ALL induction, and we are so much worried that we'll lose the patient. That's not the case. So the timing of granulocyte infusion is very important when you are really in septic shock, when you know the counts are not going to recover in a week or 10 days time, and when you know your antibiotics are not working to the expect what you want to work. And if you ask me about the do's and don'ts, so it's very important to have the correct dose of granulocyte infusion. Usually it is 1.5 into 10 to power 8 per kilogram of the recipient, or 1 into 10 to power 10. Higher dose can lead better outcome, but it also leads to complications. And we have seen 2 patients had a worsening of hemodynamic status after granulocyte infusion. We need to have the donor. It's not freely available. We need to convince it's a voluntary donation. So it's not like a platelet apheresis or blood apheresis, which is, so it's a voluntary donation, and we need to give GCSF and dexamethasone prior 12 hours prior to the donor. And it's not a one day job. We have to repeatedly do this. We have to do this for a couple of days, 3 days. Some people use for 5 days, but 3 days is the standard of care which people use. So it's very debatable question, center's preference. In this particular scenario, I would give a try, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And GCSF, it's very, again, in AML patients, there are very much doubt that we use without knowing the remission status. But people say that if you have crossed day 15, probably you maybe are in a remission, and you want to hasten the neutrophil recovery, and we can start GCSF. Usually we avoid GCSF in first 15 days of induction AML treatment or relapse AML treatment.
Thank you, Dr. Chintan. So this is the blood culture report that we got. It was an E. coli growth, and as expected, it was quite a resistant bug. So Dr. Manu, I don't know if you had a look at the report. So this is our report. How do we interpret this? And now what are the antibiotics of choice, and how long do we give these antibiotics for?
Sure. So can you just go back to the report? So if you look at this report, it's a you end up calling it XDR E. coli and carbapenem resistant. And we are seeing that quite often. Actually, in Indian ICUs, it is as high as 40%, this carbapenem resistance. And there are different types of these resistance. So OXA 48 and a lot of other OXAs. And then in India, there's these beta metalloproteinases. NDM is the word which have surrounded a lot in the academic societies. So this is definitely a carbapenem resistant gram negative. We are looking at a very highly resistant organism. They haven't mentioned the susceptibilities of colistin, TJ, and fosfomycin. Phospho we have to ask. Usually, again, our choice would be one of the polymyxins, either poly B or colistin, and with TJ or fosfomycin. Appropriate dosing, very important. And then you can also ask for these resistant patterns. So there is something called CARBA-R, which within 45 minutes will tell you which kind of resistant pattern is there, and it will help you choose the appropriate antibiotic again. So if it's just OXA48, we can use this new drug called ceftazidime-avibactam. And then because this child is gonna be in the hospital for his induction frequently, and he'll need these reserved antibiotics. So we have to be very, very mindful of what we are using. And I just want people to be aware of these diagnostic of labs which are available. There's something called MALDI-TOF. So basically, once your culture flags, you can set it up in MALDI to give you the name of the organism. It will not give you the sensitivity, but it can tell you, and that will help you, decide based on your local antibiogram that, okay, I can use this antibiotic versus that antibiotic. So use those resources. And then duration of antibiotic, whenever an XDR comes into the picture, I go at least 14 days. Also very important, source control. So if you know it's coming from your catheter, you have to get your catheter out. So source control is also a very, very important thing.
Okay, thank you so much. So yes, antibiotics were stepped up as per the microbiologist advice. Granulocytes were administered for 3 days, and thankfully the child came out count recovery on day 25. Let's move on to our next case. This is a 2.5-year-old child with a week's history of fatigue, facial swelling and swelling of the lower limb since 1 day noticed by the mother. Initial evaluation showed facial edema with bilateral pitting pedal edema, a very high blood pressure 152 by 112 and heart rate of 160. The rest of the examination was normal. There were some crackles in the lung, but there was no palpable abdominal mass. Again, Dr. Shetty, how would you approach a very, very brief history, a nightmare in the ER?
Yeah. So looking at this history and the presentation, it appears like the blood pressure is quite high, and the patient seems to be having cardiac failure secondary to it, with the facial edema and the crepitations, what you're mentioning. So it kind of looks like a sequence of that. Of course, like you said, the priority does become at this moment to manage this hypertension. And oftentimes, when patients do come like this, we do a quick echo, we look at how the LV function is, we do a lung ultrasound, make sure there's no pulmonary edema. We also do a night check and we look at the kidneys. These are the common things what we do in terms of looking at the end organ damage because of high blood pressure. And some of these patients could have CNS changes too, and might even sometimes land up with seizures. Now, once we do that, what we also parallel need to do is a workup for why would we have this hypertensive crisis in a patient who has been normal otherwise. So generally, the part of approach, we would get a stomach scan done, and sometimes depending upon the results and depending upon the clinical exam findings and the lab reports, we might plan a CT scan and essentially do a thorough workup for the hypertension. So when a patient comes like this, and a hypertension which has caused an organ, a secondary organ dysfunction, and here in this case, it looks like there's a cardiac dysfunction with pulmonary edema. So obviously, you need to give continuous infusions of antihypertensives to get the blood pressure under check. And the objective is, if you think that, especially when a patient comes like this with no past BP records, we really don't know how long the BP has been very high. So when we know that, when you don't know how long the BP has been high, you cannot dramatically and quickly bring down the blood pressure. You can't give a dose of nifedipine or something like that and just get the BP down. Because what happens is when the BP is prolonged at least for more than 3 to 4 days, then your cerebral autoregulation goes in such a way that it shifts completely towards the right side and tries to regulate a flow at a very high blood pressure rate. And you suddenly bringing the BP down can cause cerebral hypoperfusion. So in that, keeping in mind, we generally start sodium nitroprusside in this context. And then we target to bring BP over next to 48 hours generally, of which idea is to get down to 95th centile, and then we generally achieve over 1/3 of target within first 4 hours, and then slowly over next 16 hours we try to reach to 90th percentile. So that's generally what we do with this kind of situations.
So, sir, this child was actually evaluated for hypertension, and it was quite surprising that we found that the child actually had a mass in the right kidney, and the echo showed that the mass was extending all along the IVC right up to the heart. So this was the CT scan image of this child, and the NT-proBNP was also very, very highly elevated. So, Dr. Chintan, what would be your next step in management? What is the role of anticoagulation in this child, and what are the complications we expect during neoadjuvant therapy for this child?
Yeah, so looking at the CT scan picture and the history, it looks like a case of renal nephroblastoma, like Wilms tumor. Now, the first and foremost important question, whether we need to prove this by biopsy or not, that is the most important question, which every trainee participant should also know. Now, we follow two types of approaches, either SIOP or COG approach, and we know the COG is upfront surgery and SIOG is upfront chemotherapy. It is depending on particular center's choice whether they want to go for the upfront chemotherapy or a COG approach. But apart from that, it is also important to discuss with the surgeons whether this tumor is completely resectable without any significant morbidity and mortality. If the tumor is adjacent to some organs like pancreas or some intestine, it cannot be resected. If the thrombus is beyond the hepatic veins in the IVC or reaching to the right atrium, it cannot be resected completely. Very, very rarely, very few surgeons can do that type of surgeries. So now whether to do a biopsy or not, again, is a debatable question. If you have to do the biopsy, if the presentation is abnormal, like age is abnormal, or if there is extensive lymphadenopathy, and in case where you are doubting your diagnosis of renal Wilms tumor, then only you should do the biopsy. Biopsy should be done by core needle biopsy. Wedge biopsy should be definitely avoided, which can increase the upstage the disease. But if you are certainly sure, you can start patients on neoadjuvant chemotherapy and then do the surgery and get the type of tumor. And the role of anticoagulant, this is a thrombus linked with venous Wilms tumor. This is not an inherited thrombus-like situation. So in this case, particularly, surgeons can remove the thrombus. If it is in the renal vein, they can remove the thrombus en bloc, or if it is extensive, they can remove the thrombus by piecemeal. If it is involving the right atrium, the cardiac bypass surgery needs to be done. And the expected complications during neoadjuvant chemotherapy, we all know the commonest chemotherapy in this particular setup is vincristine, actinomycin, doxorubicin. If it is a stage 4, it is cyclophosphamide. So some of these tumors been treated as an outpatient because just vincristine, actinomycin, and doxorubicin. But we have to be very careful that all these three drugs are known to cause extension. So we should be very careful in giving these drugs as an outpatient by using peripheral cannula. I would avoid that. And apart from that, anthracycline, we must do the baseline echocardiography because the cumulative dose of anthracycline in this particular type of protocol reaching to 350 to 400 milligram per meter square. So we should do echo after every 150 milligram per meter square of anthracycline dose, and we should monitor for any cardiac symptoms. And actinomycin is just apart from the extraviration, it rarely causes VOD, but not very commonly. All of these drugs are very safe and can be delivered in outpatient basis also.
Thank you, Dr. Chintan. So, I mean, a biopsy was not done for this child. He was started on chemotherapy as per the SIOP guidelines. After 6 weeks, for a surgery. Dr. Kaushik, what would be your approach for surgery in this child? What are the special precautions in view of the extensive tumor thrombus, and what are the implications on staging?
Hi, good morning, Vasudha. Thanks for having me here. So the approach would be, it depends on how much the regression of the tumor is after the chemotherapy. So especially if it is just the tumor is peeping into the renal vein and the center is following a NWTS protocol where they go for upfront surgery, they can still do it. If it is limited to the renal vein, because invariably the renal vein would be ligated close to the inferior vena cava and removed. So that would not be an issue. But for this kind of a case where it has extensively involved the inferior vena cava, then always it is better. And here both SIOP and NWTS groups, they actually agree upon, especially if the tumor thrombus is extending beyond the level of hepatic veins, extending into the atria, the preoperative chemotherapy is the approach, the first approach. And then you reassess by the CT as to how much of regression is there. And during the surgery, the incision, the how do we approach would change according to that. So if it was simple, limited to the infrahepatic part of the IVC, then a standard transverse abdomen incision would do. Whereas if it is extending beyond and it has hardly responded to the chemotherapy, then a rooftop incision, something like an inverted V shape. So that is the one. And if it all it requires a cardiopulmonary bypass, then you may have to extend it like an inverted Y-shape incision where it involves a median sternotomy. Then you'll have to involve our cardiothoracic colleagues also. It will require splitting of the diaphragm in the midline, slinging the so suprahepatic and infrahepatic, infrarenal IVC, taking good control, putting a cardiopulmonary bypass. So that will be a very extensive surgery. But fortunately, according to the statistics, atrial extension is seen only in 1% of the cases, and inferior vena cava, the extending up to the suprahepatic is seen only hardly in 4 to 10% of the cases. And even in these, the response to chemotherapy in majority of them is good. So it's only a small proportion of children who would require such a big surgery. And intra-op, what challenge that we can have is though we know that Wim's tumor has pushing borders, it doesn't infiltrate, but there can still be intimal attachments of the tumor, and there can be subintimal extension. So in 2013, if I'm not wrong, there was an Abdullah classification where they have staged as to whether there was a less than 5 centimeter, more than 5 centimeter involvement of intima, and what is the extent of the tumor, whether it is subhepatic, retrohepatic, suprahepatic, and atrial extension. So this will be more based on the CT, and the intimal attachment is based on the intraop finding. So all these add to the challenges for the surgery.
Thanks, Dr. Kaushik. Yes, so he actually required both a cardiac and a pediatric surgical input, and the intracardiac tumor extension could be completely resected. But the intrahepatic segment showed vessel adhesive tumor, like you said, and it was a nephroblastoma of intermediate risk histology. Lymph nodes were free, classified, and treated as stage 3. Actually, we have another case, but in interest of time, I'm sorry, I'm ending the panel discussion here. Thank you so much, everybody, Dr. Rakshay, Dr. Chintan, Dr. Manu, and Dr. Kaushik for a great panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vasudha. Thanks.
Thank you so much.